What if the small mod you love could cost you thousands, or even your license? Riders everywhere are getting blindsided by fines that don't stop at the roadside. This crackdown is spreading fast, and you could be next. Watch until the very end, because missing this warning could be the most expensive mistake you make. From cool to costly. For years, riders have sought ways to make their machines stand out. It might have been a subtle flash of chrome, a custom decal, or in this case, a modification that quickly became one of the most shared trends in rider forums. What began as a creative tweak, part aesthetic, part performance, was proudly shown off at meetups and on social media feeds. Then came the fines. The first images were grainy smartphone shots. A rider pulled over on the side of a busy road, his customized helmet tucked under his arm, while an officer wrote up the violation. The caption underneath read, "$200 for this?" and comments exploded into disbelief. The shock came from how ordinary the mod had become. It was not a reckless stunt, nor a roaring aftermarket exhaust blaring through a residential street at midnight. It was decorative, playful, and until recently, ignored by police. Yet, in a matter of weeks, reports of roadside stops flooded local rider groups. The message was blunt. This mod was no longer tolerated. Overnight, the same touch of personality that once drew compliments now drew suspicion from traffic patrols. Riders were not just surprised, they were blindsided. They were about to find out exactly why something so popular had become a legal hazard, written into the law. Behind the sudden wave of fines lay a stack of regulations few riders had ever read. In most jurisdictions, aftermarket modifications fall under safety codes that are broad enough to cover everything from custom lighting to handlebar changes. The popular mod in question, despite its harmless reputation, technically altered the helmet structure and added protrusions that could affect crash safety. In plain terms, it violated the standard. Police did not need to prove it was dangerous in a crash. The fact that it deviated from approved specifications was enough. In places like Tamil Nadu, that deviation could cost a rider $200. In other regions, such as parts of New South Wales, a similar crackdown targeted electric bike owners whose power or speed output exceeded local limits, rules that were enforced just as strictly. These were not gray area interpretations. The language in the law was specific and the penalties were codified. Officers were now under instruction to treat the violation as a primary offense. For riders who saw the mod as a symbol of individuality, discovering its legal status felt like a gut punch. This was not about intent, it was about compliance. Sounds harmless, right? Then why are officers treating it like a primary offense? If you're already seeing how deep this goes, hit like right now. It tells me to dig even further. And drop a comment with your take because your voice here matters more than you think. This crackdown is real, and rider voices need to be heard. The fine that broke a rider. The fines did not just sting, they devastated. One rider, a part-time delivery driver who used his weekends for long group rides, was hit with a penalty that wiped out his month's earnings. The ticket included not only the fine for the mod itself, but also associated charges for expired paperwork discovered during the stop. The total climbed into the tens of thousands of dollars. When his insurance company heard about the violation, they refused to renew his policy until he could prove the modification was removed and the helmet replaced with a compliant model. For a hobbyist with limited income, it was more than an inconvenience. It meant canceling planned rides, selling off gear, and putting his bike up for partial sale to cover costs. Others told similar stories. Workers commuting on e-bikes modified for speed, now slapped with multiple fines that pushed them into debt. What felt like a harmless upgrade turned into a financial trap. It was becoming clear that this crackdown was not just a traffic issue, it was an economic pressure point, one that could force enthusiasts to give up their passion entirely. And soon they realized it was not confined to their city or state. We've prepared a list of the best gear and accessories every rider should have. Helmets, jackets, gloves, and luggage that actually pass safety checks. Don't get caught out and check the description below. The crackdown spreads. By the time rider groups began organizing to share legal advice, news was filtering in from beyond their borders. In neighboring states, similar enforcement blitzes were underway. Photos emerged from Australia's Operation Kilowatt, where hundreds of e-bikes were inspected in a single week and dozens of riders fined for illegal performance mods. Footage circulated of police unloading confiscated bikes with non-compliant silencers. The details varied, different mods, different rules, but the trend was unmistakable. Enforcement agencies were tightening their grip on aftermarket changes across the board. Reports surfaced of joint operations where enforcement teams from different states conducted simultaneous roadside blitzes. Riders traveling interstate found themselves stopped multiple times in a single day, with each jurisdiction applying its own set of fines. The message was clear. There was nowhere left to hide from the new rules. Officers from multiple regions were reportedly sharing strategies, comparing data, and even cross-training on detection methods. This was not a spontaneous set of isolated actions. It was coordinated, and that meant riders could no longer hope the crackdown would simply fade away. If anything, the momentum was building, and enthusiasts were beginning to ask themselves not if they might be stopped, but when. And that's when the crackdown got organized. Eyes everywhere. The crackdown was not only happening in broad daylight at the side of the road, it had become a networked operation, supported by tools that most riders had never imagined were in use. Portable roadside scanners could now detect certain illegal modifications without physically dismantling a bike. Cameras with high-speed image recognition could flag non-compliant parts based on shape or color variations. Even parking patrol officers were equipped with handheld devices capable of scanning for unapproved electronics, such as boosted controllers in electric bikes. In some regions, enforcement vehicles carried portable dyno units, allowing officers to test performance output on the spot. A quick roll of the throttle could reveal hidden power boosts, and once the numbers were recorded, there was no arguing. The technology turned every checkpoint into a potential trap for modified machines. In some cities, officers in unmarked vehicles trailed popular riding routes, recording high-definition footage to be reviewed later by enforcement teams. Social media was no longer safe either. Images posted to public forums were being cross-referenced by automated systems, tagging those that appeared to display prohibited modifications. The result was a net that reached into both the physical and digital spaces riders inhabited. This was not enforcement by chance. It was a deliberate, structured process designed to identify and punish violations long before a rider suspected they were under watch. The sense of being targeted was spreading through the community, and when a few officers spoke out, the story became even more complicated. The cop's dilemma. One veteran traffic officer agreed to speak under condition of anonymity. He admitted that he personally disliked writing tickets for what he considered cosmetic violations, but he explained that departmental policy left no room for discretion. In his precinct, accident reports involving modified equipment were reviewed every quarter, and if the data showed an uptick in injuries, the enforcement quota for that category increased. He recalled one week where officers were explicitly told to prioritize modification-related stops over speeding or seatbelt checks, purely to meet an internal quota. The directive frustrated many on the force, but ignoring it risked disciplinary action. It's the numbers that matter, he admitted, not always the real dangers. He described the pressure from higher-ups as relentless. Targets had to be met. Patrol patterns were adjusted to maximize stops in areas with high concentrations of modified bikes. Internal memos outlined visibility weeks, where officers were expected to issue a set number of citations for specific infractions, regardless of intent or prior warnings. The officer stressed that in his mind, the real problem was the lack of public awareness. If riders knew how the numbers get used, he said, they'd understand this is about statistics, not personal vendettas. His comments were a rare glimpse behind the curtain, showing that the system was driven as much by administrative performance metrics as by safety concerns. Riders, however, were less interested in policy explanations. They were ready to make their opposition visible. So ask yourself, if even cops think these fines are pointless, why are they still forced to write them? United in protest. The first response came in the form of petitions. Within weeks, online platforms carried demands for reviews of the laws governing aftermarket modifications. Signatures climbed into the tens of thousands. Local riding clubs organized rallies outside government offices, lining the streets with bikes in a show of solidarity. Social media feeds filled with videos of riders voicing their frustration, often using the same hashtags to create a unified digital front. Digital activism became just as fierce as the street demonstrations. Riders flooded official transport authority pages with coordinated comment campaigns, sharing videos that framed the crackdown as an attack on working-class culture. Hashtags trended for days. drawing international attention and sparking solidarity messages from rider groups thousands of miles away. The protests were not just about the specific mod at the center of the crackdown. For many, it was a broader stand against what they saw as creeping restrictions on personal expression and vehicle customization. Riders from different disciplines, sport bikes, cruisers, electric commuters, set aside rivalries to present a single coordinated message. The rules were unfair and needed to change. Some demonstrations drew sympathetic coverage from local media, particularly when small business owners in the aftermarket trade joined the cause. But despite the noise, lawmakers showed little appetite for rewriting the regulations. Enforcement continued and in some areas even intensified. Faced with a lack of official response, some riders began looking for less visible ways to hold on to their favorite modifications. Mods in the shadows. The shift was subtle at first. Riders who had been outspoken on public forums began to disappear from those spaces. Group chats replaced open discussions, and photos of bikes with obvious mods all but vanished from social media. Behind closed garage doors, the work continued, but now with a new emphasis on concealment. Stealth parts became a cottage industry. Modifications were designed to blend seamlessly with stock components, using materials and finishes identical to factory specifications. Quick-release mounts allowed riders to remove prohibited items in minutes if they suspected an inspection was coming. Some experimented with dual setups, one legal, one hidden, that could be swapped depending on the situation. Some riders even began developing modular modification kits designed to snap on and off in under 5 minutes. These quick change systems let them switch between compliant and non-compliant setups depending on the ride. It was an arms race of ingenuity, with every new trick pushing enforcement to adapt faster. Information on enforcement tactics was quietly shared among trusted circles, with tips on avoiding detection during common patrol hours or routes. It was a cat-and-mouse game, and for many, the thrill of evading the system became as much a part of the culture as the modifications themselves. Yet beneath the excitement was an unspoken understanding. Getting caught now carried even higher risks. Here's the real kicker. Riders didn't stop. They just got smarter. And that's when the game changed. And just when riders thought paying the fine was the end of it, that's when the real nightmare began. Insurance turns on riders. The rider thought the worst was over once he paid his fine. He had been stopped at a routine checkpoint, cited for his non-compliant helmet, and told to remove it before returning to the road. He complied, thinking the matter closed. But weeks later, a letter arrived from his insurance provider. They had reviewed the incident report and determined that his policy had been breached at the time of the stop. The violation, they claimed, voided his coverage for that period. It was not an isolated case. Across multiple regions, insurers began to cross-reference police data with customer records. Any mention of a banned modification became grounds for denying future claims or hiking premiums. Riders who had been paying into policies for years suddenly found themselves unprotected. Even minor infractions like decorative changes that altered safety ratings triggered the same penalty. Some insurers even hired third-party investigators to attend popular bike meets, quietly photographing machines and cross-checking visible modifications against their policyholder lists. Riders began to realize that enforcement was no longer confined to the roadside. It was following them into the very spaces where they once felt safest and most accepted. What stung most was the sense of betrayal. Riders were used to dealing with enforcement on the street, but discovering that private companies were quietly joining the crackdown felt like being blindsided by someone you trusted. And if insurance could turn against them, what other parts of the system might follow? You think it's just about money? One rider found out the hard way it could cost him his license for life. On crash, 0 chances. The fear became real when the first lifetime ban was handed down. It happened after a rider was involved in a collision on a rural highway. While the crash itself was not his fault, the investigation revealed a prohibited performance modification on his bike. The licensing authority concluded that the modification contributed to the severity of the accident, and in addition to fines, they revoked his riding privileges indefinitely. The story spread quickly through rider networks, sparking a wave of self-audits as motorcyclists rushed to check their own machines for potential violations. Some voluntarily reverted to factory parts, fearing that even a minor infraction could be magnified into a career-ending penalty if they were unlucky enough to be involved in an accident. It was a chilling precedent. Licensing penalties had always been temporary, measured in months or years. Now, one infraction paired with an unlucky set of circumstances could end a riding career forever. Lawyers warned that these bans were difficult to appeal, especially when framed as a public safety decision. Riders began to see the crackdown as more than a financial inconvenience. It was an existential threat to their identity as motorcyclists. Losing a license was not just about transportation, it was about community, lifestyle, and personal freedom. The message was clear. In the eyes of the authorities, certain modifications were worth removing you from the road entirely. And while individuals were feeling the weight, the aftermarket industry was about to face its own reckoning. Shops under siege. Dealerships and independent workshops that had built their reputations on custom work suddenly found themselves in the crosshairs. Enforcement teams began visiting businesses known for offering certain aftermarket services, demanding invoices, customer lists, and proof of compliance with regulations. Shops caught selling or installing prohibited parts faced fines that could run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, along with the threat of closure. Some shop owners tried pivoting to custom-look products that appeared stock to the untrained eye, hoping to keep loyal customers while avoiding penalties. But inspectors grew wise to the tactic, and surprise audits became more aggressive. For many businesses, the line between adaptation and violation was becoming dangerously thin. For small, family-run operations, even a single raid could be devastating. Some owners preemptively pulled entire product lines from their shelves, fearing they might be deemed illegal under tightening interpretations of the law. Suppliers, too, were feeling the strain as shipping companies hesitated to handle consignments flagged as high risk. The crackdown was no longer just a rider versus police conflict. It had become an economic enforcement campaign, reshaping the entire aftermarket sector. Communities that relied on custom work for income and culture were watching their livelihoods evaporate. Yet, just as the industry began to adapt, lawmakers delivered a new shock, one that reached even beyond illegal modifications. The law that rewrote the rules. It started quietly, buried in a larger transportation bill. The language was vague but sweeping. Any aftermarket alteration to a vehicle's safety equipment, performance systems, or structural components would require fresh certification from an authorized inspector. In theory, this applied to modifications that had been fully legal for years. In practice, it meant riders would have to prove compliance every time they made even minor changes. The new law gave regulators wide discretion to define what counted as a structural component or safety-critical part. Critics warned that it could be used to phase out the modification culture entirely by making compliance too costly and complicated. Some riders saw it as legislative overreach, a deliberate attempt to choke the aftermarket scene through bureaucracy rather than open bans. Workshops scrambled to interpret the new requirements, often receiving conflicting guidance from different inspectors. Some riders reported passing certification in one district, only to be flagged as non-compliant in another. The lack of consistency deepened mistrust, fueling rumors that enforcement was less about safety and more about exerting control. The atmosphere shifted from frustration to dread. If enforcement could now target legal modifications alongside illegal ones, there was no safe ground left. Every rider, every shop, every supplier was suddenly under the same cloud of suspicion, and that's when the ripple effects began. An industry on edge. In the weeks after the new law passed, the aftermarket industry scrambled to adapt. Large suppliers began quietly downsizing product lines, removing any item that might attract regulatory attention. Some manufacturers considered relocating production overseas, hoping to operate from jurisdictions with looser modification laws. Smaller businesses face tougher choices: retool entirely, risk staying the course, or close their doors. One accessories wholesaler admitted that sales had dropped by more than half within a single quarter. Retailers who once moved dozens of customized helmets or performance parts each week now struggled to sell a handful. The uncertainty around enforcement made stocking inventory a gamble, and insurance rates for businesses that dealt in aftermarket goods climbed sharply. Trade groups lobbied for clearer definitions and a grace period for compliance, but their calls went largely unanswered. Without predictable rules, companies found themselves planning for survival rather than growth. The once thriving culture of innovation was giving way to risk aversion, and every product launch now came with a legal review. Some suppliers began experimenting with coded labeling systems, disguising certain parts as generic replacements to slip past inspectors. While this allowed a trickle of products to reach loyal customers, it also carried heavy risks. A single discovery could lead to seizures, ruin reputations, and end decades-old family businesses overnight. It was becoming clear that the crackdown was not just rewriting rider behavior, it was reshaping the very market that had fueled motorcycle individuality for decades. And into that uncertainty stepped a very different set of players: the politics of control. As the industry stumbled, political figures began to stake their claims on the issue. In some regions, candidates framed the crackdown as a bold step toward public safety, positioning themselves as champions of order. Others used it as proof of government overreach, promising to roll back what they called nanny state regulations. Campaign speeches featured dramatic anecdotes, either about reckless riders endangering families or about hardworking enthusiasts punished for harmless creativity. The reality was more complex, but in the hands of politicians, the story became a convenient tool for rallying voters. In some legislative circles, the crackdown became a bargaining chip. Promises to ease restrictions were traded for unrelated political concessions, turning the fate of riders and businesses into a tool for advancing broader agendas. For those directly affected, it was proof that their livelihoods had become currency in political games. Behind closed doors, lobbyists saw the shift as an opportunity. Safety advocacy groups pushed for even stricter standards, while industry representatives sought carve-outs for specific products. In the noise of election season, both sides fought to control the narrative, and riders became talking points rather than participants in the conversation. The political attention did nothing to ease the situation on the ground. Enforcement continued. Businesses still faced closures, and riders still faced penalties. Yet, in this political theater, the real impact was spreading beyond the riding community and straight into the daily lives of ordinary consumers. Why everyone pays. For people who had never swung a leg over a motorcycle, the crackdown might have seemed distant, until the ripple effects reached their own wallets. As aftermarket businesses scaled back, the prices of certain safety gear, performance parts, and even basic replacement components began to climb. With fewer suppliers and higher compliance costs, shops passed expenses down the line. Small towns that relied on motorcycle tourism began to feel the strain. With fewer riders on the road and less spending in local cafes, motels, and repair shops, the economic pinch spread beyond the aftermarket industry. Entire communities were discovering that the crackdown's cost was far from limited to parts. Consumers looking for quality helmets, jackets, or gloves found themselves with fewer options and steeper price tags. The second-hand market surged briefly, but even there, fear of hidden non-compliance drove cautious buyers toward the shrinking pool of certified goods. Meanwhile, the principles behind the crackdown, tight oversight of modifications, began seeping into other sectors. Car enthusiasts saw increased scrutiny on tuning parts. Cyclists faced new rules about frame alterations. Even home hobbyists in unrelated fields began to wonder if their projects might one day be regulated under similarly vague definitions. What began as a targeted campaign against one mod had become a wider experiment in how far regulators could push and how quickly industries and consumers would adapt. And if there was one question left hanging in the air, it was about the boundaries of personal freedom. If you've stayed with me this far, you know this isn't just a story, it's a warning. Subscribe now, because the next story is already unfolding. You'll want to see it first, not hear about it later. Staying ahead could be the only way to prepare. Freedom or permission? The debate was no longer about helmets, silencers, or e-bike controllers. It had become a discussion about where the line between personal choice and regulatory authority should be drawn. To some, the crackdown was a reasonable step to protect lives and ensure fairness in the marketplace. To others, it was a slippery slope toward a future where individuality was treated as a liability. Philosophers, journalists, and cultural critics weighed in, noting that modification, whether of machines, homes, or clothing, was a form of self-expression. Restricting it too aggressively risked eroding the cultural diversity that comes from personalization. On the other hand, advocates for strict rules argued that public spaces and shared systems depended on uniform safety standards. In private conversations, some lawmakers admitted the precedent was powerful. Once citizens accepted restrictions in one domain, expanding them elsewhere became easier. Critics feared this gradual normalization could lead to a society where permission, rather than freedom, defined daily life, changing the relationship between individuals and the state forever. In cafes, garages, and online forums, writers posed the same hypothetical. If they can ban something as small as a decorative mod, what else could be deemed unacceptable tomorrow? The lack of a clear answer kept the unease alive. Because in the end, the crackdown was not just about machines, it was about the kind of society writers, regulators, and citizens were willing to build together. And that conversation had only just begun. You've seen how quickly this can go from a ticket to a total takeover. This isn't hype, it's happening now. If you ride or if you care about your freedom on the road, you need to stay ahead of it. Subscribe right now so you're not caught off guard when the next wave hits. Share this with every rider you know, because the more we know, the harder it is for them to win in silence.